In this lecture, we'll look at the mechanics of breathing. Breathing is also called pulmonary ventilation. Inspiration is the same thing as inhalation, and expiration is the same thing as exhalation. Breathing is accomplished by changing the thoracic cavity volume. This ends up changing the lung volume. The most important muscle for breathing is the diaphragm. It's a dome-shaped sheet of skeletal muscle that lies between the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity. So you can see here in this X-ray, the diaphragm would be approximately where I'm showing here. Above that, you see the lungs. So the X-rays can go through the lungs, whereas below the lungs, you have the diaphragm and the abdominal organs, and those show up as opaque in this X-ray. And the heart also shows up as opaque. So during inspiration, the diaphragm contracts, and that lowers the floor, essentially, of the thoracic cavity. During expiration, the diaphragm relaxes and it moves upwards, becoming even more dome-shaped. And this reduces the volume of the thoracic cavity. And a reduction in the volume of the thoracic cavity leads to a reduction in the volume of the lungs, and this leads to an increase in pressure with the lungs and therefore expiration. The diaphragm is the major muscle of inspiration. As I mentioned before, it separates the thorax from the abdomen. It's skeletal muscle. It's innervated by the phrenic nerves, which are bilateral. They originate from the cervical nerves C3 through C5. Those come together to form the phrenic nerves on either side. Contraction leads to an expansion of the thoracic cavity as the diaphragm descends. And then relaxation leads to a reduction in the volume of the thoracic cavity. During inspiration, the diaphragm descends and increases the depth of the thoracic cavity. At the same time, during inspiration, the ribs move up and out on the sides. And we'll talk about the muscles that do this in the next slide. But for now, one thing to try and understand is how this works. Well, the ribs move up and out on the sides, and one model of that is the handle on a bucket. It moves up and out, and that will increase the dimensions of the thoracic cavity from side to side. At the same time, the thoracic cavity actually expands in the anteroposterior direction, in other words, from back to front. And again, there's certain muscles that are involved in that. One is the Sternocleidomastoid. It pulls on the sternum, and it pulls the sternum up and out, and that would increase the dimensions of the thoracic cavity. And one way of thinking about this action is it's similar to a pump handle. If you pull on a pump handle, you pull up and out, and that increases the distance between the handle and the rest of the pump. So during inspiration, again, the major muscle is the diaphragm. Now, the other muscles that are important would be the external intercostal muscles, which are shown here. When those contract, they raise the rib cage during inspiration. So again, we have this sort of expansion of the rib cage up and out to the sides. Aiding the external intercostal muscles are the parasternal intercostal muscles, which are shown here. They do a similar thing. They pull the rib cage up and forward in the anteroposterior direction. And again, that would help to increase the volume of the thoracic cavity. All those muscles are active when we're just doing quiet breathing. It's primarily the diaphragm, but the external intercostal and the parasternal intercostal muscles do help a little bit during quiet breathing. As the intensity of the breathing increases, in other words, as the depth of the breathing increases, there are other muscles that come into play. The scalene muscles, which are shown here, elevate certain ribs. And this is said to be a forced inspiration. It's the sort of inspiration you do when you're exercising heavily. The pectoralis minor also elevates ribs for forced inspiration. It's not shown, but I'll show you that muscle in a subsequent slide. And the sternocleidomastoid muscles elevate the sternum also during forced inspiration. Usually this muscle really doesn't come into play unless you're doing really very deep, heavy breathing. The pectoralis minor muscle is active during forced or deep inspiration. This elevates ribs in the antero-posterior direction. Inspiration requires, at the very minimum, the diaphragm to be active. Quiet expiration, in other words, when a person is just resting, is a passive process. After being stretched during inspiration, the thoracic cavity and the lungs recoil, decreasing the volume of the thoracic cavity, leading to a decrease in lung volume, which leads to an increase in pressure within the lungs, and the expiration occurs. However, when we're exercising, we have forced expiration. There are certain muscles that become active, such as the internal intercostal muscles, which are shown here. When these contract, they lower the rib cage. Note that these are different than the parasternal intercostal muscles. Additionally, when we're doing forced expiration, say during exercise, abdominal muscles contract, forcing abdominal organs up against the diaphragm, which tends to push the diaphragm up further, again, further reducing the volume within the thoracic cavity and therefore reducing the volume of the lungs, within the lungs, and leading to even greater expiration. The two principal abdominal muscles that are involved in this forced expiration would be the rectus abdominis and the external abdominal obliques. Let's review the mechanisms of breathing. During inspiration, the volume of the thoracic cavity and the lungs increases vertically when the diaphragm contracts and flattens, and laterally when the parasternal and external intercostals raise the ribs. The thoracic and lung volume increase. Therefore, the intrapulmonary pressure decreases, and this leads to air coming in. Recall that the intrapulmonary pressure is the same thing as the intraalveolar pressure. During expiration, the volume of the thoracic cavity and lungs decreases vertically when the diaphragm relaxes. It becomes more dome-shaped. And laterally when the external and parasternal intercostals relax for quiet inspiration, or when internal intercostals contract in forced expiration to lower the ribs. During expiration, the thoracic and lung volumes decrease, and the intrapulmonary pressure increases. This leads to air being pushed out. During normal quiet breathing, contraction of the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles increases the thoracic and lung volume, decreasing intrapulmonary pressure to about -1 centimeter of water below atmospheric pressure. During expiration, relaxation of the diaphragm and external intercostals, plus the elastic recoil of the lungs, decreases the lung volume and increases the intrapulmonary pressure to about 1 centimeter of water above atmospheric pressure. During inspiration for forced ventilation, inspiration is aided by the contraction of accessory muscles such as the scalenes and sternocleidomastoid muscle. This leads to a decrease in intrapulmonary pressure to about -27 centimeters of water relative to atmospheric pressure. During expiration for forced ventilation, the expiration is aided by the contraction of abdominal muscles and the internal intercostal muscles. The contraction of these muscles increases the intrapulmonary pressure to +40 centimeters of water above atmospheric pressure. This diagram summarizes the things we've been talking about. At rest, the intrapulmonary pressure is the same as atmospheric pressure, and therefore there's no movement of air in or out of the respiratory system. During inspiration, there's the diaphragm descends and the other changes occur that we talked about. This leads to an increase in the thoracic volume and an increase in the lung volume, and therefore a decrease in the pressure within the lungs. So the pressure within the lungs becomes 1 centimeter of water below atmospheric pressure, and this leads to the movement of air into the lungs. Note that the interpleural pressure is -8 centimeters of water. So the intrapleural pressure is always below that of the intrapulmonary pressure. At the very end of inspiration, there's no pressure difference. In other words, the diaphragm is contracted and the various other muscles have contracted, and there's no further expansion of the thoracic cavity and no further change in lung volume. Therefore, at the very end of inspiration, again, the intrapulmonary pressure is equal to atmospheric pressure. At that point, the diaphragm relaxes, the external intercostal muscles relax, and so the volume of the thoracic cavity becomes lower and the volume of the lungs becomes lower, and this leads to an increase in pressure within the lungs. So for quiet breathing, we now have a pressure of about 1 centimeter of water above atmospheric pressure, and this leads to the movement of air out of the lungs. Note that the intrapleural pressure is now at -5 centimeters of water. So it's below that of the intrapulmonary pressure. And so the intrapleural pressure is always lower than the intrapulmonary pressure. And this helps to maintain the lungs such that they're essentially stuck to the thoracic cavity, the inside of the thoracic cavity. Finally, at the very end of expiration, the diaphragm is relaxed, the external intercostal muscles are relaxed, and the elastic recoil has ended. And at this point, there's no further change in the volume of the thoracic cavity, and therefore no change in volume of the lungs. And at this point, the intrapulmonary pressure is the same as the atmospheric pressure, and therefore at the very end of expiration, again, there's no movement of air in or out of the lungs. Pulmonary function may be assessed using a technique known as spirometry. With spirometry, a subject breathes into and out of a device that records volume and frequency of air movement. For example, we'll measure lung volumes and capacities, which we'll discuss in further slides. This technique can be used to diagnose restrictive and obstructive lung disorders, which we'll talk about in detail later. But just as an example, it could be used, for example, to diagnose chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD. In respiratory physiology, there are lung volumes and lung capacities. We're first going to talk about lung volumes. A lung volume is a measurement of the amount of air for a single relatively simple function. For example, tidal volume is the amount of air either expired or inspired during quiet breathing. So for example, if we look at this figure, we have an individual. Let's start after they've expired. Now they're going to inspire air, and so the amount of air within their lung increases. We could measure that, and that would be the tidal volume. Alternatively, we could start from the point where they've inspired air, and now they expire air, and this goes down, and again, that would be tidal volume. Let's next imagine that we're curious about how much reserve volume this person can expire. So the way you do this, you'd ask the person to inhale and exhale normally, just with normal quiet breathing. So at the end of expiration, you then ask them to continue to expire forcefully as much as they can. And then, of course, they would be allowed to breathe in again. So then the expiratory reserve volume is the amount of air that can be forced out after a normal expiration. So this is now, you'd start measuring at the end of the normal expiration to the minimal value. And that difference would be your expiratory reserve volume. The inspiratory reserve volume is the amount of air that can be forced in after a normal inspiration. So you'd ask your subject to inspire normally and then continue to inspire as much air as they possibly can. Now this difference, or this amount that they were able to inspire, would be the inspiratory reserve volume. The residual volume is the amount of air left in lungs after maximum expiration. Residual volume is determined by competing factors. The strength of the expiratory muscles and the inward pull of the lungs tend to decrease the residual volume. and the outward pull of the chest tends to increase residual volume. And so this is one of the factors that measures that can't be measured directly using spirometry. We need to evoke other methods such as gas dilution techniques or body plethysmography techniques to actually measure the residual volume. So far, we've looked at lung volumes. Lung capacities are the sum of two or more lung volumes. For example, vital capacity, or VC, is the amount of air that can be forcefully exhaled after a maximal inhalation. So we would ask our subject to inhale as much as possible. So we'd be at this point here, and then exhale as much as possible. And the volume of airflow would in fact be the vital capacity. Note that vital capacity is equal to the inspiratory reserve volume, which we can see here, plus the expiratory reserve volume, which is here, plus the tidal volume. When you add those three volumes together, you should have the same thing as vital capacity. Another capacity is the inspiratory capacity. This is the amount of gas that can be inspired after a normal expiration. So we would ask our subject to expire normally and then inspire as much as possible. Total lung capacity is the amount of gas in the lungs after a maximal inspiration. So you could see it here. Note that we don't actually know, just based on spirometry, we can't measure total lung capacity because we would be missing the residual volume. And so again, you'd have to use some other technique to find the residual volume, and then you could calculate the total lung capacity. Similarly, the functional residual capacity is the amount of gas left in the lungs after a normal expiration. It's shown here. And again, so this is equal to the residual volume plus the expiratory reserve volume, which we can measure. But remember, the residual volume can't be measured directly using spirometry. So we have to rely on a gas dilution technique. So the way that's done is you could have the subject, for example, breathe in a known concentration of helium, such as 10% helium and oxygen, and then use that to be able to calculate the residual volume within the lung. We may want to know how much a person is breathing per unit time. So it's a breathing rate, and that's referred to as the total minute volume, and its units are usually liters per minute. So the total minute volume is equal to tidal volume, which is in units of liters per breath, multiplied by breaths per minute. At rest, for a typical adult, the total minute volume is about 6 liters per minute. This increases tremendously during exercise. During exercise, the total minute volume may be 100 to 200 liters per minute. The respiratory system has two zones, the conducting zone and the respiratory zone. The function of the conducting zone is to conduct air to the respiratory zone. It also functions to humidify, warm, and filter air. The components of the conducting zone are the nasal cavity, the oral cavity, the common tube that the nasal cavity and oral cavity converge upon, which is called the pharynx. After that, the larynx, the trachea, the major bronchi, and the other elements of the bronchial tree, ending with the terminal bronchioles. The respiratory zone is the zone in which exchanges of gas occurs between the air and the blood. This consists of the respiratory bronchioles, the alveolar sacs. So let's take a look at this. So after the terminal bronchioles, you can see that there are other bronchioles that have the occasional alveolus. So these are referred to as respiratory bronchioles because they do have some respiratory function due to those alveoli. After that, the alveoli ducts, and then you have the alveolar sacs. So the term alveolar sac actually refers to a group of neighboring alveoli. Now that we understand that there's a conducting zone and a respiratory zone, we should understand that there's something called anatomical dead space. Anatomical dead space is the volume of the conducting zone. the amount of air that reaches the alveoli, which each breath is less than the tidal volume because of this conducting zone. There's essentially air that's, as you breathe in, there's some of it actually gets to the alveoli and mixes with whatever air there was in the alveolar airspace, but some of it never even reaches the respiratory zone. It's just stuck within the conducting zone. For example, given that tidal volume is 500 milliliters and the anatomical dead space is 150 milliliters, what percentage of fresh air in a breath reaches the alveoli? And another problem, if the tidal volume is 2,000 milliliters, given the same anatomical dead space of 150 milliliters, what percentage of fresh air in a breath reaches the alveoli? To do this calculation, you would take the tidal volume, you would then subtract the anatomical dead space. So 500 minus 150 would be 350 milliliters. Divide that by the tidal volume, which is the amount that was inspired, and then multiply by 100 to convert to a percentage. So we would get a value of 70%. So this means as we breathe in, when we're at rest, about 30% is essentially stuck in the anatomical dead space and never actually reaches the alveoli. Now this changes when we're exercising. So when we exercise, we breathe a lot deeper, so the tidal volume is greater. So that's what if we use this value of 2,000, we'd still have the same anatomical dead space. So we'd have 2,000 minus 150, and then you divide by the size of the tidal volume, the amplitude of the tidal volume, which is 2,000, multiplied by 100 to convert to percentage, and we get 92.5%. So this means that when we're at rest, a lot of air does end up just getting stuck within the conducting zone without actually getting to the alveoli. When we're exercising, this becomes less of a problem. There's only a small percentage that it's essentially stuck in the conducting zone and never reaches the alveoli. So this means if a tidal volume is increased, then the anatomical dead space becomes less important. Here's some terminology you should know. Lung volumes are the 4 non-overlapping components of total lung capacity. Tidal volume is the volume of gas inspired or expired in an unforced respiratory cycle. In other words, we're talking about the tidal volume during quiet breathing. Now, this would be tidal volume the way it's defined for the purposes of measuring the various lung volumes. I should just point out that it is possible you could measure tidal volume, say, during exercise, and you would just specify this is the tidal volume during exercise rather than during quiet breathing, and that would be completely valid also. Inspiratory reserve volume, that's the maximum volume of gas that can be inspired during forced breathing in addition to the tidal volume. Expiratory reserve volume is the maximum volume of gas that can be expired during forced breathing in addition to the tidal volume. Residual volume is the volume of gas remaining in the lungs after a maximal expiration. Lung capacities are measurements that are the sum of 2 or more lung volumes. The total lung capacity is the total amount of gas in the lungs after a maximal inspiration. Vital capacity is the amount of gas that can be expired after a maximal inspiration. This one will turn out to be quite interesting and very useful for measuring the health of the lungs. So we'll talk about that more in subsequent slides. Inspiratory capacity is the maximum amount of gas that can be inspired after a normal tidal expiration. And functional residual capacity is the amount of gas remaining in the lungs after a normal tidal expiration. As I mentioned earlier, the vital capacity, or VC, is the maximal volume of air that can be expired after a maximal inspiration. And this in itself is quite a good measure of a person's lung capacity. However, there's another way of looking at the health of lungs, which is to look at the forced expiratory volume, or FEV1. This is the volume of air expired during 1 second during maximal expiration. In other words, you'd ask a person to do a maximal inspiration, and then they would do a maximal expiration for about 3 seconds, and you'd measure the volume of air that was expired during that 1 second. And even more helpful is to take both of these measures and put them together. You can do the forced expiratory volume 1 divided by the vital capacity. And now you have a ratio. And the advantage of this, of course, is that the vital capacity is going to be different for people of different ages, different sizes, and so forth. Here you're doing essentially a normalization of the forced expiratory volume 1 by the vital capacity. For most people, if they're healthy, the FEV1 over VC ratio will be about 80% or greater. Now, if it's below 80%, this may suggest the presence of an obstructive pulmonary disease. So let's look at this diagram in some detail to try and understand how this would work. This is plotted a little strangely. Here's time on this across the bottom here, and time is going from right to left. I'm not quite sure why they did it this way, but here's a person who's breathing, and then they're doing a maximal inspiration and then holding it for about a second, and then they're doing a forced expiration as fast as they possibly can for 1 second, and then they continue to expire until they're back to their normal breathing pattern. And so what you can see here is the person reaches their total lung capacity, which is in this case 5 liters. At the very end, they've done the maximal expiration, so they're going to reach the residual volume. In this case, it's 1 liter. So presumably, again, as I've said, you can't really measure this directly using spirometry, but you could use a gas dilution technique, and then you could figure out what the residual volume was. But the main point is we can, even without the residual volume, we could figure out what the vital capacity is. It's simply the difference between whatever the volume was here, and it's the amount that they've expired over, say, the 3 seconds, right? That would be the vital capacity. And then to figure out what the FEV1 would be, it would be the difference between, it would be essentially the amount of air that they expire during that 1 second. And so again, that's easily measured with spirometry. So let's take the example of this person. A is a normal person who's healthy. FEV1 equals 5 liters. Remember, it's going to be the amount that they expired over that 1 second. So it's 5 liters minus 1.8. That's the amount they expired. And we're going to divide that by vital capacitor VC. Vital capacity is 5 minus 1 because they have a residual volume of 1 and they have a maximal inspiration of 5 liters. So when you do the calculation and you multiply by 100 to get a percent, then you have 80%. So this is a healthy person. Now, shown in purple is another person. So we'll imagine that they have the same total lung capacity and so forth. So they get to 5 liters. And now during the 1 second of forced expiration, they expire much less. They only expire 2.5 liters because 5 liters minus 2.5. So again, with the calculation of FEV1 and divide it by the same vital capacity because it's the same in this particular example. And now it's much lower. This person was, their FEV1 to vital capacity ratio is 62.5%. And this suggests then that this person does have some sort of obstructive pulmonary disease. And you can sort of see that that's sort of a little bit self-evident. But in that 1 second, they weren't able to expire as much air. Using spirometry, we can essentially classify all lung disorders as either being restrictive or obstructive. A restrictive disorder is one in which the vital capacity is reduced, but the FEV1 to VC or vital capacity ratio is normal. Examples of this kind of disease would be pulmonary fibrosis and emphysema. The reduced vital capacity indicates that there's been lung tissue damage. Now, the other kind of lung disease would be obstructive lung disease. So this is where you might have a normal vital capacity, but the FEV1 to vital capacity ratio is reduced. And a classic example of an obstructive lung disease would be asthma. The lung tissue is not damaged. This person has a normal vital capacity, but the expiration takes longer, and this would be due to bronchoconstriction, which increases the resistance to airflow. Another type of a disease that might be classified as obstructive is certain diseases related to smoking. Smoking will reduce the FEV1 to vital capacity ratio. People with pulmonary disorders frequently complain of dyspnea, which is a subjective feeling of shortness of breath. Dys is a negation, and pnea has to do with breathing. Asthma has certain symptoms such as dyspnea and wheezing. It's caused by inflammation, which leads to increased mucus secretion and constriction of the bronchioles, which makes breathing more difficult because there's an increase in airway resistance. Asthma is often also called an airway hyperresponsiveness disease. In other words, it's a responsiveness that's perhaps too extreme. In other words, you might have allergens or something like that, and your system has sort of taken it on itself to respond in a sort of exaggerated manner. The most common type of asthma is triggered by the inhalation of allergens, which stimulates the secretion of cytokines, which cause inflammation. However, asthma can also be triggered by cold or dry air. It's often triggered by exercise. So, for example, if you have someone who's exercising in slightly cold or dry air, this leads to dehydration of the airways, and this can lead to an asthma attack. In a certain subset of people, aspirin can also lead to an asthma attack. Asthma is reversible with a bronchodilator such as albuterol. Albuterol works by preventing bronchospasm. So recall that there's smooth muscle associated with the bronchioles. And so those can actually constrict too much, making leading to an increase in airway resistance, making it very difficult to breathe. So albuterol would lead to bronchodilation, which would make it much easier for the person to breathe. Emphysema is a long-term progressive disease of the lungs that causes shortness of breath. Cigarette smoking is the primary cause of emphysema. It leads to the destruction of the alveoli, and this leads to a reduced surface area for gas exchange. What happens is the alveoli tend to become weaker, the walls become weaker, and the individual alveoli, which can be quite small, will join together with alveoli, essentially leading to the generation of very large alveoli. And the problem with this is these alveoli, not only they're too large, but their walls are very weak and so forth. And so they're not able to put enough pressure on the bronchioles to maintain the bronchioles open. And so during expiration, there's an increase in pressure within the lung, and some of these bronchioles may close. And this leads to a phenomenon called air trapping, in which regions of the lung will have trapped air that should be expired but can't get out. And so this greatly decreases the efficiency of gas exchange within the lung. As I said, smoking is the most common cause, and it triggers inflammation and destruction of the alveoli by immune cells. One very common type of pulmonary disease is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD. This is characterized by inflammation and narrowing of the airways and alveolar destruction. It typically includes actually two diseases, emphysema as well as chronic obstructive bronchitis. This can be diagnosed by seeing an accelerated decline in FEV1 over time as the disease progresses. Again, it's a disease of inflammation. It's often caused by smoking. So 90% of people with COPD are or were smokers. And what smoking does is it triggers excessive mucus production and inflammation. In people with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, smoking may promote the infiltration of obstructing fibrous tissue and muscle in the airways, causing increased airway resistance. Smoking may also promote remodeling of blood vessels in the lungs, leading to pulmonary hypertension. Recall that the systemic circuit has a mean arterial pressure of about 100 millimeters of mercury, The pulmonary circuit has a mean pressure of only about 15 millimeters of mercury. It's about 25 during systole and only 8 during diastole. With this hypertension, there's extra work essentially that the right ventricle has to do to overcome this higher pressure. And this condition may develop into what's called cor pulmonale, which is pulmonary hypertension with hypertrophy of the right ventricle, meaning the right ventricle wall becomes thicker, and eventually this may lead to failure of the right ventricle. Unfortunately, there's no cure for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and it's currently the 4th leading cause of death. In certain people that have lung damage, they'll accumulate fibrous tissue in the lungs, and this may be due to inhalation of small particles. An example would be black lung or anthracosis in miners, which is due to the inhalation of carbon particles from coal dust. If we look at this graphic, we can see what's going on. There are tiny particles that in the dust that are released during the mining operation. The particles end up in the lungs alveoli. And then normally you have macrophages. Remember we talked about those earlier. Those protect the lungs by engulfing foreign particles such as bacteria, but also things like dust particles. And normally these would escort the foreign material through the thin walls of the alveoli, where they can be cleared. But if there's too much dust that's been inhaled, the macrophages end up clogging up in the air sacs. They can't get the foreign material out, and it makes it harder for these air sacs to work. Eventually, you get scarring within the lungs. And then eventually this can lead to shortness of breath, persistent cough, and night sweats. And unfortunately, this disease can take years to develop, but actually it can even progress after a miner has left working in the mines. So it can continue to develop. And it really, everything's connected. So the miner may develop an enlarged heart. And we can imagine why that would be. There's probably pulmonary hypertension, like we just described previously. And so eventually you may have heart failure. They're also more susceptible to pneumonia and other respiratory diseases because of the weakened lungs.